Well, welcome everyone to this webinar here today. We're so pleased that that you're here to join us, and it's great to see already in the chat box many familiar names showing up. Welcome to this event, and also to those of you who are watching a recording of this event. I know that there has been quite a bit of interest already about how this event will be shared afterward, because some folks couldn't attend this particular time slot but are looking forward to seeing it later in the recording. So my name is Peter Noteboom, and I serve as the General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches, and I'm pleased to just say a couple of short words to introduce our event today. The Canadian Council of Churches responds to Christ's call for unity and peace, seeks Christ's truth with an affection for diversity, and acts in love through prayer, dialogue, and witness to the gospel. We bring together 26 member churches from across Canada who in their membership represent some 13,500 worshiping communities across Canada and 85% of Christians in Canada. We want to acknowledge, of course, that the Canadian Council of Churches and our members are on the traditional territories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across Canada. We're all on their traditional territory if we're here in Canada or North America. And more than just to acknowledge that traditional territory, I invite you to reflect on how our location, how our relationship to the land, and how our connection and relationship with the first peoples of this land informs, enriches, and challenges our reflections on our topic today: creation, theological reflection on life sciences, gene editing, and so on. Since the last century, since 1999, the Council has hosted this group already more than 20 years. This group has been reflecting on biotechnologies and faith and life sciences issues. And so this is kind of a cumulative project, let's say. It's a continual process of learning. And as a non-scientist myself, I've really appreciated the learning opportunities that have come along through the work of the Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group, which is hosting the event today and who did the planning and design for it. And we're so grateful for your work doing that, and also for, of course, the special guests and panelists, presenters who will be sharing what they know and what they have learned and their process of critical reflection today. They've produced several resources over the years, which you can find on the Canadian Council of Churches website. The most recent one is a kind of cumulative reflection on guidelines for how to think about theologically and ethically the relationship between ethics and faith and life sciences and biotechnologies, and I commend that document to you. It's in a working document phase now, but should be published before the end of the year or early next year. This event is offered free of charge, and we invite you to consider making a donation to the work of the Council. Your donations would, of course, help offset the cost of this event, of putting it on, and other ongoing work of the Council. You can find the link in the chat box via Canada Helps as a way to make that charitable contribution. So without further presentation or words of welcome, just a warm welcome to all of you who are with us, and those of you watching afterward in a recorded format. I'm pleased to invite Dr. Peter Kunert, who is co-chair of the group, along with Joan Masterton, who's also on the screen with us, to introduce our special guests for this webinar. Please, Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us from coast to coast to coast for this, our third CRISPR webinar, as presented by the Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group of the Canadian Council of Churches. As Peter said, I'll be your moderator for this afternoon's event. I represent the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada on the reference group. And along with Reverend Joan Masterton, I have the privilege of being a co-chair for this triennium. CRISPR, of course, is a gene editing biotechnology derived from the common bacterium, E. coli, a biotechnology that the bacterium has used itself for millennia to keep its own genetic material safe from damage by invading viruses. In the last 10 years, scientists have figured out how to apply this biotechnology to edit human DNA, animal DNA, plant DNA, all with amazing ease and accuracy. In our first webinar, for those of you who were able to attend, Dr. James Rusthoven helped us understand the science behind this CRISPR biotechnology. In our second webinar, he helped us understand the history of attempts to govern and regulate this biotechnology. Adding urgency to this conversation was the November 2018 surprise announcement by a Chinese bio-entrepreneur that he had used CRISPR to genetically design twin girls, ostensibly to prevent HIV transmission, our world's first genetically designed children. In the book of Genesis, the first chapter, we're told, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." Of course, for thousands of years, humans have pondered, what does it mean to be created in God's image? Have you or we or us ever considered the human genome to be a symbol of being created in God's image? For it is from these genetic sequences that are created our rationality, our relationality, our spirituality, our agency, and our procreativity. In 1997, UNESCO declared the human genome underlines the fundamental unity of all members of the human family, as well as the recognition of their inherent dignity and diversity. In a symbolic sense, it is the heritage of humanity. Today, we're focused on the theological and ethical implications of this CRISPR biotechnology. In 2002, Stephen Allen, former chair of this committee, wrote in the booklet Life Patent Pending some reflections about the Canadian Council of Churches' role in opposing the Harvard University attempt to patent a genetically altered mouse, the oncomouse in Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada, of course, did not allow this. Stephen Allen wrote at that time, "We are Adam and Eve in a new and risky Eden. We share with all humanity the call to discern wisely how to name and how, or even whether to use the new powers that are now on offer." That was almost 20 years ago. How much more so today do we stand in that new and risky Eden before the tree of knowledge of good and evil and ponder, what are we to do next? Our panelists today, we are delighted to share the reflections of 4 panelists. Each will have about 7 minutes to present their reflections. Thereafter, we will open the floor to questions from our attendees. Between the panelists and the questions, we'll take a 2-minute stretch pause, so you can plan for that. Please write your questions in the chat box, and we will address your questions from there. Let me introduce our panelists in the order that they will be speaking. Our first panelist is Tracy Trothins, an ordained United Church minister, supervisor and educator in clinical spiritual care, CASC, and a professor of ethics at Queen's University, jointly appointed to the School of Religion and the School of Rehabilitation. She serves on the Faith and Life Science Reference Group on behalf of the United Church of Canada. Dr. Moira McQueen, our second panelist, has been teaching moral theology at St. Michael's Faculty of Theology in the University of Toronto since 1994, and has written and co-authored many articles and book chapters in bioethics, fundamental ethics, and many other areas. Her book, Bioethics Matters, was updated and republished in 2011 and has been translated into many languages. Dr. McQueen was appointed Executive Director of the Canadian Catholic Bioethics Institute in July 2004. Michael Buttry, our third panelist, is a doctoral candidate in Christian ethics at Regis College, part of the University of Toronto. He represents the Anglican Church of Canada on the Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group. And our final panelist, Dr. Francoise Baylis, is University Research Professor at Dalhousie University. She is a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of Nova Scotia, as well as a fellow of the Royal College or Royal Society of Canada, and a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. She is author of the book Altered Inheritance, CRISPR and the Ethics of Human Genome Editing, a member of the governing board of the International Science Council, and a member of the WHO Working Group on Principles of the Global Guidance Framework for the Responsible Use of the Life Sciences. Panelists, we are delighted that you are here with us tonight to share in your reflections. Thank you on behalf of us all. Now turn over to Tracy Trotham, who will be giving us a brief overview of some key theoethical issues related to CRISPR technology. Tracy. I think Tracy is still muted.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And now I am indeed unmuted and am going to share my screen. It's a privilege to be here. I am delighted to be in the company of these wonderful folks who are presenting today. And I hope to introduce just a few key theoethical issues that we will be pursuing in more depth through the presentations. So we're looking at CRISPR, and Peter introduced us very effectively to that. First of all, I think it's really, really important that we acknowledge that Christianity has a very strong history of a commitment to healing. This healing mandate is made clear in the Jesus healing stories in sacred scripture, and as well as in the duties that are very clearly delineated in scripture to love our neighbors, love God, and ourselves. So CRISPR may indeed be very helpful in treating a number of very terrible disorders and allow people to live much longer than they would and much better than they would. So there's a lot of very, very powerful and very strongly oriented therapeutic research going on right now that holds a great deal of promise, as we've heard in our previous two webinars. Problems, we know that there can be off-target effects. We don't know what those would be necessarily because, of course, this is all very new, these technologies. So we always have to have a caveat in place that says something other than what we intend could happen. There are many controversies associated with this technology, in particular, the modification of the human embryo, which we'll be hearing about more later, and heritable changes, meaning if we affect the germline cells, that we could pass changes on to next generations without their consent. And even if we decided that we made a mistake, perhaps we will not be able to fix it, although it's possible with CRISPR that we will be able to go back in and make changes. CRISPR technology can be used for a variety of purposes. Let's look at just a few of them right now so that we can consider these as we move forward. For enhancement, so not just for therapeutic purposes to bring us up to a level of health that is considered normal, even though that's a problematic concept, but also to make us even better. The problem, of course, is who decides what's better. What does better mean? And right now, with there being so much power disparity in the world, it's those with the most power who are at the helm of driving a lot of these changes. So we need to be suspicious and I think very deliberate in making people be accountable as these technologies move forward. May even be used in sport to improve athletic performance, increase strength, increase focus, all sorts of different features that are considered desirable in sport. Could be used to prevent violent behavior, impulsive aggression. But can you imagine that if it's decided to be used on people who are convicted of violent crimes? What could that look like? Could even be used to change features, including skin color. Now, there's a really loaded issue right there, at least it should be. There is research going on, I understand right now, around animals and changing their fur, their coats. So this is not that far-fetched. And given our strong oppressive nature in the globe right now, this is a big problem, something to be aware of. Could be used for military purposes for the treatment of PTSD, which could potentially be a wonderful thing. Could be used to increase tolerance of chemical or biological attacks. Could increase muscle mass, greater focus, ability to stay awake longer. Could even be used to reduce remorse, apparently, and to create bioweapons. Also, we're seeing usage application in the area of agriculture, livestock, other species, the environment. And there's talk about creating chimeric animals that could supply organs for people who need transplants and would not reject those organs. So we need to be very conscious and ask questions like, what is it that we really want? Theologian Ron Cole Turner says, I think this is a really important quote, technology offers to give us what we want, or at least what most of us think we want: longer life, youthful bodies, greater health, and mental ability. Christianity invites us to give up what we want, indeed to give up life itself as the one condition for real life. At the same time, we are entrusted to be stewards of our lives, to treasure what we're given, this life that we're given, and to protect it, and of course, to follow that healing mandate. Then there's the question of acting on what I want, the question of choice. This is really increasingly complex because choice is becoming more and more driven by the individual in our society. But within Christianity and Christian tradition, choice needs to be clearly about community, about global community, about interdependence. We have a Trinitarian model of relationship and community. We have models that celebrate vulnerability and fragility and dependence as virtues, not as negatives. Unlike normative culture, too often we're taught that those features of being human are things we should try to get past and get over. So that's something for us to be aware of. The dignity and intrinsic worth of all people as created in the image of God, and being of value in and of ourselves. Questions about divine sovereignty. Whose are we? Do we focus more on our individual rights or our collective responsibilities to each other and ourselves? And is there a place at which we could engage both? Christianity and justice. This is such a big topic here. I think this is potentially the most significant ethical issue from a theological view. Are we playing God, or are we actually functioning as created co-creators, as people who are made in the image of a creating and creative God? So again, that question about healing, we need to be working at creating, but doing so humbly and holding ourselves to account communally. We need to ask questions in holding ourselves to account about who's benefiting from these technologies. What are the costs of therapies? Who benefits from the stocks? What about co-design? Are we including marginalized groups at the table at the beginning of the design of tech creation using CRISPR? Or are we catering to the preferences of the powerful? What does the model of the Messianic banquet suggest to us about how we approach the design, even much less the access to these technologies? And most importantly, will we edit out marginalized groups and therefore amplify marginalization? For example, will we decide that being deaf is a bad thing and therefore risk marginalizing deaf culture instead of celebrating it? Who decides what we need to fix? We need to consider the Christian mandate for a preferential option for the marginalized being at the center of all that we stand for. And lastly, my final slide, what do we hope? For what do we hope? CRISPR opens the door to a greater wellness and longevity by healing disease, but are there limits? And how do we decide what those limits are and how we create and apply this technology? What difference does it make to this conversation to believe in life after death? Does it make a difference? And how might a love of life and a love of others drive us in this conversation about CRISPR? What difference does it make to embrace God's healing mandate? Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy, for those reflections. We are going to save all questions until the end of our 4 panelists. Our second panelist now, Dr. Moira McQueen, will be providing a brief summary of a Roman Catholic approach to CRISPR gene editing of embryos, indicating where it agrees or disagrees with current practices or proposals. Thank you, Moira.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Tracy, for getting us off to a really wonderful start. And you covered so many terrific points and very broad sweeps, because this is such an all-embracing type of scientific technology. And I'm bringing it back a little bit to theoethics and the gene editing of embryos. But in the context, I think, as some of the points you made, points about justice and points about marginalization. And I think these actually apply to embryos as well. No, it won't move. My slides are not moving on. Rebecca, I'm sorry, but my slides just refuse to move on.
Hey, a thought is to stop sharing screen for a moment and then try resharing.
Okay.
And while you do that, I'll also pull up your slides.
Sorry, everybody. Now or never sounds sort of appropriate.
Are they working at all for you, Moira?
No, they won't move.
Okay.
Will I stop sharing again?
Yes. Can
Okay.
you see your
Yes.
slides?
Yes, thank you. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not sure why that happened. In any event, talking about it from a Roman Catholic perspective, then we're very often, I think, sort of outliers in this particular respect because of the concern that we have for embryos and embryonic experimentation, especially at the minute to do with CRISPR. And so there have been recent reports on ethics and governance, and they nearly all have concluded that the technique is not safe enough yet in terms of being able to actually transfer embryos which have been edited to the womb. And I think nearly all scientists agree with that. There has been one example where somebody went ahead and really, so the scientific community did not approve because they actually considered it reckless behavior because it isn't really at the point yet where it's safe enough to transfer. At the same time, the International Society for Stem Cell Research has just changed the amount of time that's usually allowed for embryonic experimentation. Embryos are usually held in culture till about 14 days because there is the whole process of cell multiplication that has happened before that. And there has been a sort of consensus that a different process begins at 14 days. Nevertheless, there is now this way of keeping the embryos in culture for a longer time, which extends the period upon which they can be experimented. And from a Roman Catholic point of view, that is a problem, an ethical problem. I mean, I certainly agree with all sorts of possible advances in gene editing using CRISPR, given the caveats about safety and the problems of off-target results, all those kinds of things that in due course will probably be resolved. And so, but now we're talking about gene editing in people on the ground, so to speak. Starting with, though, an embryonic success in 2017 at the Salk Institute, where there was a repair of single gene mutation. And scientifically, it seems as if that's the sort of thing that's going to be much more likely than multiple mutations in people. That kind of makes sense, I think. So from a Roman Catholic perspective, the question of the value of embryos just remains dominant. It really is determinative in terms of how our ethics are worked out. We talk about the dignity of the embryo in two particular documents, the gift of life and the dignity of the person. And these revolve around the definition of what is a human being, who is a human being, and what is a person. And of course, the question of personhood, I think everybody knows, varies. It's a philosophical and sometimes a legal definition, and it varies from group to group, certainly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But it's not the case again in Catholic teaching, where both those documents I mentioned talk about the embryo as created, as made, and therefore come into existence. And they will not go into the complicated philosophical question of what or who is a person, but nevertheless recognizes, as everybody recognizes, that this conceptus is a human being. And the way it's worded is it's to be treated as a person with the rights and dignity of a person. Of course, in a country like Canada, where to be a person, one has to be completely delivered from the birth canal of one's mother before one actually has rights, then this is a very different viewpoint from this idea, the Catholic idea of the embryo being treated as a person from the moment of conception, and therefore really should have rights as well. In terms of the ethics of embryonic experimentation, then it's a problem from my perspective that this is rarely done for the embryo's own benefit. It's being done so that we will learn from the experiments done upon it. The embryos usually die as a result of the experimentation. The question of consent I put in here because it's such a huge question in law and a very important question, but somehow is never considered in this particular context. Whereas if taking the sort of view I do of the embryo as to be treated as a person, clearly this question of consent wouldn't be able to be applied here, and that's an ethical problem in itself. Gene editing is problematic as well when we're talking about embryonic experimentation or even treatment, because it means that to treat some kinds of genetic malformations, the ongoing creation of embryos would be the preferred way to go. From a scientific point of view, that's logical, but again, from the ethical point of view, it's problematic. And I've just repeated there again, this idea that embryos are now going to be able to be kept intact for a longer period of time for experimentation purposes. It is a little bit of a conundrum. I use that word because although our Catholic teaching finds ethical problems in this making of embryos outside the normal human way of doing so, but once created, because the Catholic Church itself is saying that the embryo as human actually has the same dignity as every other human and must be treated as such, because that's the logic of that while any experimentation for other people's benefit, which compromises the embryo, that's not ethical, that's not justified. But if in fact CRISPR treatment was at the point where it could actually benefit the embryo, would that be ethically acceptable? And it seems again in terms of our logic that in fact would be the case, other risks, etc., having been dealt with, but specifically because we are saying this is a human being to be treated as a person, and it would be specifically for that embryo's benefit and not for somebody else's. Okay, so we do share the similar concerns with all other ethicists and scientists about the knowledge, about probabilities, about the risk-benefit ratio. The question of off-target results is still very much in the forefront of most people's minds, hence the hesitation about embryos after gene editing actually being transferred to the womb for reproductive purposes. At the same time, there are some ethical questions about parents' choices, our subjective view of illness and disease that affect our view of other human beings. And I think we do have to ask questions such as, when gene editing of an embryo is being done, is it really for the benefit of that little embryo, that human being in existence? Are we really being altruistic, or are we being self-centered? Is the benefit for the child, or in many ways, that means that if it's, we have to really, I think, be concerned that we may in fact be thinking of ourselves. And I think my time is up, so I don't think I can finish the last 2 slides, but thank you.
Moira, thank you for helping us think about the challenging topic of human embryo research. And I'm sure there will be questions about that when we come to the discussion. Our third panelist today, Michael Buttrey, will be talking about virtue ethics and gene editing, exploring the application of patience, intellectual caution, and charity to decisions about gene editing, especially heritable human gene editing. Michael, thank you for leading us in this reflection.
Thank you. For my section, I'm going to talk about how the virtues can help us respond rightly to gene editing technology. Virtues are an ancient concept that go back to the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle and have been central to the ethics of many Christian theologians, such as Thomas Aquinas. A common example of a virtue is the virtue of courage. Aristotle celebrated the courage of soldiers in war. Aquinas did as well. The theologian also praised the courage of those who care for the sick, despite the risk of infection. We praise the same virtue when we honor healthcare workers who have risked their lives to help the sick during the pandemic. Given our enduring appreciation for courage, is courage the virtue we need to use gene editing rightly? Yes and no. Some advocates of radical human enhancement have claimed we're too afraid of gene editing, which could cure dozens of diseases and improve abilities and lifespan if we could just muster the courage to use it. But for Aquinas, having courage does not mean never feeling fear. That's recklessness. Rather, being courageous means having the right amount of fear for the right reasons. Thus, because the word courage can be misused, I'm not going to call for more courage. Instead, the first virtue I recommend is patience. Patience and courage are similar, both involve enduring hardship, and scientists themselves have celebrated patience, including in a 2010 Slow Science Manifesto, which Dr. Baylis discusses in her recent book. Given the recent pandemic, the need for such patience should be clear. Yes, fast work by scientists has allowed us to understand COVID and produce incredible vaccines. But there's also been periods of considerable confusion, including about treatments. The problem with fast science is not the speed of work of researchers and labs, but the fact that we have rewarded impatient systems of academia, business, and media, where being first is best, even at the expense of clarity and certainty. Therefore, I think we can learn more about patience from the care of the sick. Being sick is, of course, miserable. You're in pain, you can't do things you enjoy. Thus, when we're patients in hospital, we're often impatient. We want things fixed and fast. And for that reason, a crucial guide in caring for the sick is the medical imperative: first, do no harm. This rule was developed when medicine had limited power and great potential for harm. It's therefore appropriate for human gene editing, which is still in its infancy. But to enable doctors and scientists and policymakers to follow this rule, we, as patients and as citizens, also need patience, even if it means waiting longer for genetic therapies and treatments. A second virtue I recommend is intellectual humility, which includes skepticism. Now, there's a lot of skepticism today, so it may seem perverse to recommend more. But I think a skepticism born of arrogance is different than a skepticism born of humility. Arrogance says, I know what's up. I don't need to listen to others. This attitude can be found among both hardcore science skeptics and radical human enhancement advocates. In contrast, humility says, there are limits to our knowledge, but I'll try to learn more. And for non-scientists, learning more doesn't require getting a master's or a PhD in genetics. Sometimes we just need enough information to make key distinctions. For example, the gene editing technology of CRISPR has a risk of creating new mutations, what's called off-target results. For use on bacteria or plants, this is not a problem because we can breed multiple generations and throw out any defective lineages. But editing an entire human genome is different because throwing out defective lineages of human beings is not okay. Thus, we should be skeptical of claims that we can edit the genome of whole human beings as easily and safely as plants. That doesn't mean that human gene editing has no future. There's already some evidence we can extract cells from a living patient, change those cells, and put them back safely. But again, editing a few cells is different than changing all the cells in a person or even generations to come. That's why human gene editing advocates need humility, and we do too, because we cannot expect virtues in others that we do not pursue ourselves. I'll put it another way. Being critical of new technologies is fine, but lumping all forms of gene editing together is simplistic. Instead, cultivate humble skepticism, attend some webinars, spend some time in Wikipedia, and learn enough to make the crucial distinctions that we need. Then we can honestly call for humility in others as well. The final virtue I recommend is justice. Definitions of justice vary, but Aquinas defines the virtue of justice as a habit of giving everyone what they are due. Put another way, justice is about knowing what we owe one another and making good on our obligations. Many questions of justice are raised by human gene editing. Assume, for the sake of argument, that gene editing becomes safe and effective. That still leaves a nightmare scenario of segregation, like in the movie Gattaca, where the rich and powerful restrict access to gene editing for themselves, while the poor are left genetically inferior. But while we can all see the problems with a Gattaca-style future, I fear our own visions of the future can still be unjust. Let's suppose that a cure for a genetic disease costs $1 million, and after careful deliberation, the Canadian healthcare system agrees to cover it. Now, anyone within Canada with that disease can be cured. That would be an occasion for rejoicing for Canadians and people in other countries that can afford it. But the rest of the world may be out of luck, especially if the international patent system is used to stop others from developing similar gene therapies. True justice therefore requires not only asking what we owe our children, family, and friends, but also what do we owe to strangers, people far away from us? And to know that, we have to ask. Some might want a moratorium on human gene editing. Some might want less patents on genetically modified crops. And some might say we have more basic obligations to fulfill first. Such conversations are unpredictable and therefore uncomfortable. But if we bypass them and advocate based solely on our interests as middle-class Canadians, we are not more just than the special interests we are trying to supplant. If we want a just world, we need to start with becoming more just ourselves. That's it. Patience, humility, and justice. 3 virtues I recommend for shaping our response to gene editing.
Thank you, Michael, for helping us reflect on how virtue ethics might help us think about gene editing. We'll now turn to our 4th and final panelist, Francoise Baylis, who will be providing a high-level summary policy overview from the years 2015 to next year, actually, 2022, looking at international efforts to regulate CRISPR gene editing with a particular focus on consensus building and increasing the number of voices involved in these decision makings. Francoise, you're joining us from London, England tonight. We're grateful for your time. Delighted to have you as our panelist. Thank you for leading us in this reflection.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to have this opportunity to share some of my views with you. And let me say, you've already been treated to 3 really engaging presentations, and I wish I could just jump in there with a number of questions and comments. But I'm going to pull back and try to provide you with what I think you will experience as a whirlwind tour of some of the global debate discussion that's been happening, with attempts to set, if you will, some kind of a governance or policy framework. And I hope that that will then lead us to having some more conversations about how all of us can participate in those deliberations. So you've heard in the introductory remarks, I'm planning to take us from 2015 all the way, I hope, to 2022. So 2015 is the year in which a Chinese scientist for the first time published an article sharing information that he had worked with non-viable embryos. So these are embryos that would not be able to go on and become one of us because of some systemic genetic defects, had not transferred these embryos to a woman for the purpose of gestation, had done this work in a lab. And already there was a great furor. And at the end of 2015, there was what was called the first international summit in Washington, D.C. I was a member of the planning committee for that meeting. And at the end of the meeting, we issued the following statement. And there's going to be a little bit of a couple of dense slides, but I think it's really important for you to be able to see the actual wording, because you're going to see a shift. And the shift is very subtle, but very important. So at the end of 2015, and this is in a context where a scientist has manipulated non-viable embryos and not transferred them to a woman, at the first international summit, we say it would be irresponsible to proceed with any clinical use of germline editing unless and until. And what you have then next are 2 conditions. The first, in terms of safety and efficacy, is understandable insofar as you don't want to hurt people, and you also don't want to sell them a bill of goods if it doesn't really work. So those are, if you will, scientific criteria for going forward. But the second, broad societal consensus, has nothing to do with the science. It could be safe and effective, and we might still say we don't want to do this. And so by setting up these 2 conditions, if you will, we were trying to sort of say, yes, there's a specific contribution from the scientific community, but there's another kind of contribution that has to come from society in terms of discussion, debate, dialogue. Now, shortly thereafter, there was a committee by the National Academy of Sciences in the United States that issued a different document with a slightly different perspective, shall we say. So in their document, they're basically saying that clinical trials meaning using materials in a clinical setting with humans, clinical trials using heritable germline genome editing should be permitted. Now, I want to say really clearly, nothing major has happened in terms of the science. Right? So it's not that we now have safe and effective science and we're moving to a different conclusion, but it should be permitted provided that the research is for compelling reasons and for under strict oversight. So I want to suggest to you, this is actually a very dramatic shift, and it's worth asking why this shift at this time. Now, what becomes very interesting is on the basis of this document, another Chinese scientist went ahead with work also involving the manipulation of human embryos, but this time those embryos were in fact transferred into a woman. And as you heard in the opening remarks, twin girls were born from genetically modified embryos. And so we have our first CRISPR babies, so to speak. Now, this announcement happens days before the second International Summit on Human Genome Editing. And remember, the first International Summit, 2015, non-viable embryos, nothing transferred to a woman for reproduction. 2018, we have viable embryos that are manipulated. We have transfer to women. We have pregnancies. We have live births. And at the end of that summit, we have a different conclusion. And I want to say very clearly, I was not on the planning committee for this second summit. And now the conclusion is it's time to define a rigorous, responsible translational pathway towards such trials. So you now actually have children born, and we're no longer saying it would be irresponsible. We're saying we better do a better job at defining the pathway from the lab to the clinical setting. It's quite dramatic. Now, what happens shortly after that is that a number of people who were part of the 2015 planning committee and not part of the 2018 planning committee felt that they needed to say something. And what happens then is a number of people, including Eric Lander, who's now the science advisor to President Biden, and including two of the people who are widely recognized as the CRISPR pioneers, issued a statement in the high impact journal Nature calling for a moratorium on human genome editing in this kind of context. And I want to say really clearly, I'm a co-author to the call for a moratorium, and we're very explicit. A moratorium is not about a ban. It's about saying we need time to think things through and to have a conversation. And we hypothetically suggest 5 years. Give us 5 years to at least start some kind of dialogue to figure out what we think are the priorities, what are the goals and objectives, where are we going? Now, what I want to say really clearly is in the context of saying that, the emphasis is it's about allowing discussion. It's ultimately then about trying to move towards what we previously called for, this broad societal consensus, where we're able to think through not just the scientific aspects of this, but also the cultural, the social, the ethical, the legal, etc. Now, one of the things that I think is really important is that when we made this call for a moratorium, the information we had access to was the following. What this is a map of the world, and 39 countries had been surveyed, and you see in a number of places that there's a ban, that the ban is entrenched in law, legislation. In other cases, there's a ban, but it's only in guidelines, which won't have the same kind of enforcement capacity. And in some places, it's restrictive, it's ambiguous. For a lot of the world, we know nothing. Now, when you think we're approximately 200 countries in the world, and there's different ways of counting the number of countries, to say that we only have information about 39, well, that motivated the call for a moratorium. It's like, stop, let us think this through. We can't be thinking through the issues if babies are popping up. What's interesting is that since then, colleagues and I have actually done empirical work, and this is actually what the real world looks like. It's not 39 countries. It's actually closer to half the world, at least where we've been able to get information, already has policy in place saying this cannot, should not be done. So the thing that then becomes interesting is to think about the call for a moratorium and the people who objected, because ultimately the only countries they could be referring to are the ones in either dark or light gray. So you need to ask, well, why wouldn't you want a moratorium in those countries? Because the countries that actually have the capacity largely to do this research are already widely marked in red. So are you thinking about traveling to places where there are policy gaps or there aren't the resources in terms of governance to be able to do this science? Seems to me we need to ask and answer those kinds of questions. So let me again, on my whirlwind tour, take you up to where we are today. In 2019, we're actually saying in another document, and this is part of WHO work, it's a committee that was set up on governance. I was a member of that committee. And in that context, we say again, it would be irresponsible at this time. It's slightly different wording. You don't see in this statement the reference to broad societal consensus, but largely what's important about this statement is it actually comes from the Director General of WHO. So our committee was advisory to the Director General, and this is an excerpt from the statement from the Director General in 2019. Why? Because in 2019, we had another scientist, Denis Rebrakov in Russia, who said, you know what Zhang-Q He, the scientist in 2018 did, that was bad science. I'm going to do it better. And so our committee said, wait a second, this is the same problem we've been alluding to. It's not just about science. Since then, in 2020, we've had an international commission of science academies, and they too have said it's important to avoid irresponsible practices, but they, looking uniquely at the science, have said that there are ways in which it would be acceptable to proceed. I can't go into the details of that, but it is interesting to see the criteria set forward. In 2021, we have the document that Moira alluded to earlier, which is from the International Stem Cell Research Committee, and she made reference to the section that has to do with embryo research. But I'm actually drawing your attention to a different section, which is just about what should be prohibited. And the interesting thing is that heritable human genome editing in the previous guidelines was prohibited. And in the current guidelines, it's not prohibited, it's just not permitted. And so I think it's interesting for us to think about, what do you think the difference is between not permitted and prohibited? And lastly, in 2021 as well, the World Health Organization's Committee on Governance came out and ultimately repeats what was said in 2019. Now, the reason for saying we're actually taking it up to 2022 is that the third International Summit on Human Genome Editing will be in March 2022, and I am a member of that committee. Now, when you keep getting these comments interspersed about where I am or I'm not a member, it's really in the context of wanting to do full disclosure in case you perceive conflicts of interest in the things that I do or don't say, do or don't defend. So very quickly, 2015, non-viable embryos, no babies created. The statement says it would be irresponsible. 2018, viable embryos, children created, and we're saying it could become acceptable in the future. And so the question is, hold on, what are we going to say in 2022? Very quickly, in terms of my own work, since 2015, because I was part of that call for broad societal consensus, I've actually been working and publishing on what does that mean. And one of the things I'm very clear about is consensus doesn't mean unanimity, it means unity. And it's in that context that what I'm looking for is starting certain kinds of dialogues where we can get to a point where everybody believes they've been heard. And that's really important. There is no way in the heterogeneous world that we live in that everybody is going to agree with whatever it is we might come to a consensus about. Very quickly, I put this up here so that we can come back to them hopefully at some point. These here are the principles that are actually built into the WHO report. They're about how we should make decisions and what should inform the decisions that we make. And you'll see here some of the things that I think have been alluded to by the previous speakers. It's the core values. What is it that we care about that can then inform the direction in which we try to move science? Having said that, we're about to go and take our break. And I think that this might be an open-ended kind of question that we could choose to reflect on and come back partly with some comments on this and maybe some questions for myself or the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Francoise, for leading us in that high-level overview of regulatory attempts in the last 15 years to build a international consensus. Thank you to our four panelists for all your reflections today. We are at the point of taking a short break. We will now take a 2-minute break and then invite you to use this time to either reflect on the question Francoise has provided or to put your own questions in the chat box, and we will gather again in exactly 2 minutes. Thank you to all our attendees today. See you in 2 minutes. Attendees, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from our short break. Can someone nod? Can you hear me? Can you hear me well enough? Yes, thank you. Okay, we're now going to move to our question portion of this webinar. And we have a first question from our General Secretary, Peter Noteboom. Let me just find that question here. I think this question is for Francoise, but other panelists may respond too. What are the consequences for researchers or scientists who do not follow international guidelines, particularly regarding experimentation and implementation that goes beyond what is currently allowed in guidelines? And does this differ from country to country across the globe? Perhaps, Francoise, you'd like to start with answering Peter's question.
Right, so guidelines don't have force of law, and it also really matters who has issued the guidelines. And in some sense, the most that can happen is that you might be ostracized or you might lose your membership in some kind of professional organization. One of the things that I think becomes really important is that when guidelines are issued, if they are issued by a government organization, they can, within that country, have a different kind of impact. So the simplest example in a Canadian context is unlike other countries, we actually have very little legislation that's specific to research involving humans. What we do have is the Tri-Council policy statement. But if you were to violate that, you would lose your funding. If you were to violate that and it was seen to be that you had done something extremely egregious where you should have consequences greater than just losing your funding, and you were to end up in a court, they would say this was the standard and you failed to meet it. So there are important ways in which guidelines can have influence and can be referred to and incorporated into legal proceedings, but they are different from legislation. Now, what I will say, I will comment on the international stem cell guidelines, because those are guidelines that have been mentioned in at least 2 of the presentations. And in a strict sense, they don't have any force other than to, if you will, try to have an influence in 2 arenas. Try to have an influence in those countries that have no legislation, and try to have an influence in those countries that have legislation that doesn't support the view of the International Stem Cell Network. And so in that context, for example, there are many, many countries around the world that have a limit on research involving human embryos, and that limit is 14 days. There are many countries that don't have that as legislation, but they have that in their guidelines, and that used to be in the guidelines of the Stem Cell Network until 2021. So in changing that, what they're really trying to do is to signal to countries, we scientists now think differently about this, and we think that you should update your legislation. It has no force of law. And right now, I would say to you, it's extremely contentious. Many people, including myself, have published articles calling into question what it is that they were doing, partly because they didn't propose an alternative, they just removed that statement. So it isn't as if they said, no, it can't be 14 days, it has to be 21 days, or no, it can't be 14 days, but we have to have a special committee. It was like, we don't want a limit anymore. And that's the end of it. We just don't want a limit anymore.
Thank you, Francoise. I'll open the, any other panelists wishing to comment on the issue?
Hey, Peter, sorry.
Okay.
Just picking up on Francoise's point, which is a really excellent one, about that sort of semi-arbitrary way in which something like limits on experimentation can be made. And it really just seems to me highly problematic from an ethical point of view, especially if you look at it from the biological and sort of development from embryo into fetus point of view. What the reasons why that sort of thing is being done. And I can really only come to that one conclusion, that it does provide material, human material, for scientists to go on with further experimentation. It clearly isn't for the benefit of the embryo again. And so it really is not even so much that point, which is a root point for myself, but the whole question of, if somebody more or less decides, let's change this, it seems to be incredibly easy to do so. Despite the fact that we're still talking about human life. So it's just, it's a highly, highly problematic area. And I think also Francoise is indicating that, yeah, some countries have laws, but laws of course can be changed, as Canadian law was, for example, in terms of definition of person. And again, maybe that was a more societal consensus, which I think Francoise is advocating as a sort of better way to come to a conclusion. But to me, it's just a real problem that scientific bodies themselves can, if you like, sort of change the formula, just like that.
Peter, if you'll permit, I'd just like to expand on that again a little bit more, because I think for many people around the world, never mind CRISPR, just the use of human embryos for any kind of research is deeply problematic. So I think it might be helpful to just understand some of that concern and the policy context in addressing that concern when you have constituents and people with very different views about the moral status of developing human life. So in case it's helpful, one of the things to appreciate about the 14-day rule is it actually gets proposed and introduced in the late 1970s in the United States as a strategy, a political strategy for moving forward with this research in the human embryo. And 14 days is proposed in the context of a phenomena, a biological phenomena called twinning and recombination. What can happen up to 14 days is that 2 embryos can join, that's the recombination, and you create a condition called fetus in situ, or you can have what's called twinning or the separation. So 1 embryo can become 2, and scientists argued humans can't do that. Souls don't do that, and therefore, after 14 days, then we'll say it's protectable human life. But until 14 days, when it has these strange characteristics that we don't recognize in humans, it can't be protectable human life. That's not the most accurate scientific description, but I want you to appreciate that's by and large what was being proposed.
Right.
Meanwhile,
Francoise, the question about fission is really important, and also another question. But I think just biologically, the whole question is that at 14 days, the process of self-division stops. And so there is a scientific basis for that. Not maybe it is and maybe it isn't. Isn't even a question about souls, just purely physical and biological.
Sure, I'm just saying that there was a lot of debate at the time.
When the process of cell division stops at 14 days, that is the real time when, for the embryo to develop into the being, further into the being that it already is, that it should be transferred to the womb. And so that's my concern again, of course, about when scientists have now extended the period, then it can only be for one reason. That embryo is clearly not ever going to be allowed to develop further, but only to be used for experimental purposes.
Okay, well,
thank you to both our panelists. Perhaps we could hold that conversation and allow some other questions to come forward. Would that be all right? I'll check with you, Francoise. You wanted to respond there?
No, I just wanted to finish the biological argument so that people can appreciate there was another part of the world that tried to argue differently, just because I think it helps to show the diversity, even when there's commonality. So I was just going to make the point that Mary Warnock in the United Kingdom comes up with the same date, 14 days, but reasons differently. And the reason for that is that she's looking at the development of the precursor to the brain. And that happens on 15 days. And so then she says, well, we've got to be cautious. So we'll use 14 days as well. So it was really just a little point of biology to say that different parts of the world, different kinds of views and values, try to find something that they have in common. And the main point I wanted to make is my own view is that ultimately it's not about biology. It really is about ethics and morality. It's about what we choose to value. And that when we go to biology, we're really just infusing it with some kind of meaning. But the answer is not in our biology. The answer is in the things we choose to care about.
Yeah, and of course that would be a sort of diametrically opposite view to mine, which is saying that when we're treating human beings, biology has to be the sort of fundamental concept from which we can reason and even do ethics.
Okay, thank you to our panelists for an engaging conversation there. I'll move to another question from the chat box. This is from Sydney Das, or Sydney Dam, sorry. How do you advise those? How would you advise those on how to sort through all the conflicting information regarding this issue? Particularly when thinking about education systems and faith communities. And what I understand from that question is how you talked about unity, not unanimity, Francoise. You talked about hearing all important positions on the issue. How do we get people to think about these issues in the flood of information that's available in a way that they can concretely respond?
Well, I think I have a perspective that tries to start conversations looking for what we can agree on, not what we disagree about. There's lots we disagree about, and sometimes we can't get beyond that. And so for me, and I try to explore this in my book, Altered Inheritance, I actually say the key issue is what kind of world do you want to live in? And if we can spend a lot of time trying to figure out what kind of world we want to live in, then from there we can ask the question, will this technology help us build that world? How might this technology help us build that world? And I think in that sense, I have an affinity for the kinds of concerns that Michael was alluded to with his emphasis on the virtues. I want to live in a just world. So let's have a conversation about what we think a just world would be like. Now, if you're not interested in justice, we're going to have to try and back up a little bit more and say, okay, well, where can we still find some commonality? Certainly, again, something that Michael alluded to, humility. I think you cannot move towards any kind of consensus any kind of unity if you truly believe that you can't learn anything from anybody. Because then when you go into a conversation, you have nothing to learn. You're just there to persuade or to bully. Whereas I think if you can go into any kind of conversation, believing that just maybe one person might be smarter than you, just one, and that you're looking to find that person, you can actually possibly make some progress. And so I'd like to turn it to Michael to maybe weigh in on some of that.
Sure, thank you. My initial thought when I read today's question is that we need to develop our capacity for boredom. And the reason I put it that way is because a lot of the basic scientific information is available out there, but I think myself and many others, we have an instinct to rush to the people who will say, okay, here's what's going on, and then here's the decision or the opinion or the conclusion that you can come to based on it. Learning some of the basic information about how gene editing works, etc., is not necessarily that difficult, but it requires a certain capacity for boredom to just be like, okay, I just want to understand this on my own, on its own merits, before I get to evaluating these questions of what do we do with it. I think then the other part of that, of course, is listening to others. Not just choosing, okay, here's an expert, they come to conclusions I like, I'm going to just listen to them, but having a diverse range of educators and influences in your life, sometimes people you disagree with, but who think carefully, and you're like, oh, okay, I'll think about that. That's, I think, the two suggestions I have off the top of my head for how to start to sort through these questions better.
Thank you, Michael. I'll just open the conversation up to other panelists if you'd like to add any commentary.
I'll make one really quick comment, and that's building on what Michael's saying, that not only the capacity for boredom, but the capacity to accept that many of us will distill a complex position. That this is a complicated issue, and that it's not unusual to come out with some concerns on the one hand and some limits, as well as some desire to want to make things better and to pursue healing. So putting it again in dialogue with the faith convictions and the values and the virtues that we hold based on our faith identities is really important. And I think that too often in wider society, we can be talked out of or convinced that what we believe isn't, as a faith, isn't as morally relevant to these issues as what it really is. So to trust that what you bring from that faith-informed perspective is of great importance.
Thank you, Tracy. Moira, any thoughts on the question?
Well, I really do appreciate the whole concepts, obviously, of humility and justice, recognizing, of course, that even those very often are interpreted in different ways by different people. One's idea of justice can very often be quite different. So that in itself is another, I think those are wonderful ethical backgrounds that really could apply to everything, of course, every single area, and to this area, therefore, as well.
Thank you. Thank you all of our panelists for answering that question. I'm going to use my prerogative as moderator to ask a question. And I'm going to start with Tracy. Tracy, in your presentation, you asked the question, what does better mean? CRISPR is about enhancement. Sometimes enhancement means weeding out conditions that you no longer wish to have afflict your children or your progeny. So there was an article in Scientific American in February 2021 called The Dark Side of CRISPR. Perhaps some of you have read that article, written by two women who each have a genetic condition, one called cystic fibrosis, another syndactyly, who say, my life has meaning. CRISPR threatens to edit out the condition that I have, so in the future I wouldn't exist. Who gets to decide what conditions are diseases, what conditions actually allow for unique communities and unique attributes? Any thoughts on that, Tracy?
Thank you, Peter. I have lots of thoughts on that. Yes, you're absolutely right. Who gets to decide what constitutes or who is a valuable human being and what should be edited out, what should be fixed? There's a documentary called Fixed, actually, that is a really powerful documentary that I highly recommend to everybody. But as we all know, it's those with the most power who will be informing much of this, and we need to be wary of zeal to make things better without sitting back and really taking apart what we think it means to be a better human being. So just because someone has greater cognitive capacity, does that mean that they are better? Or is there's something else valuable about being a human? And I think that from a faith perspective, we know that there's definitely a lot more that's valuable about being human. But living in the world that we live in, we tend to be pushed to prioritize our thinking capacities at the expense of our being. So, what does it mean to be of value in God's world? How do we understand that, and how might that kind of lens and starting point affect where we go with CRISPR? How does it affect our understanding, as Moira and Michael were saying, about justice, the meanings of justice, and co-design? Whose voices belong at the table? How do we decide whose voices belong at the table? Whose voices are not even being heard yet in these conversations? So thank you, Peter, for that important question.
Thank you, Tracy. I'll open that up to the other panelists. Michael, do you have any thoughts you want to share?
I think Tracy's, covered it, so I'll save my time.
Thank you. Our other panelists?
I just, funnily enough, just did another TV program on ableism, as they're calling it. And so it really fits with that question, because the people on the panel who have maybe physical differences were really talking about how society still makes them feel unwelcome or lesser or problematic, all those points of view. And that the idea of, nothing for us without us, instead of our thinking that we should rush in and correct these, to us, problems, when in fact, in many cases, so many people have come to terms with who they are and how they are, and are living very productive lives. So that question of doing things to make people better is, again, a truly open-ended question, but it's very, very interesting, I think, to listen to the people who are in general in society considered the ones that we think they should be better, but we never think that we're the ones that should be made better.
Thank you, Moira. Francoise, anything you want to add?
I think this might just be a useful point in the conversation to draw the distinction perhaps more clearly for all of us between what's called somatic human genome editing and germline heritable human genome editing. And so one of the things that I think really comes to the fore here is that difference. So when you're doing somatic genome editing, somatic just means your body cells, so your hair cells, your skin cells, your liver cells. Germline genome editing is referring to your reproductive cells. So that can be your gametes, your egg and sperm, or the early human embryo, or the precursor cells to the gametes, the egg and sperm. And it's when you make changes to gametes that you end up with what are called heritable changes. And so that's the context in which many people are concerned about the fact that you might decide embryos with these traits are going to give us human beings that we don't think have valuable traits, and therefore we're going to either change those or discard those embryos. But I think what's interesting is that the same kinds of questions can be asked with respect to somatic genome editing in terms of what things you think are in need of treatment. And I think many people, and we are moving into clinical trials right now, so I think it is important to be aware of that, moving into clinical trials for certain disease conditions. The one that's making rapid progress, for example, is sickle cell disease, and that's being offered where you would be making changes to somatic cells. And many people would see that as positive because you're responding to suffering, you're hoping to introduce a treatment. But you are, in fact, also raising questions of social justice that Michael alluded to, because the cost of these treatments will be phenomenal, and they will therefore only be available to a segment of society. So that's one whole set of ethical questions. But another place in which you're seeing this, and I think this builds on what Tracy was saying, is this idea that you would use species typical functioning, and that's one of the phrases people have, to determine when it's reasonable to try to make a change. And I think the most robust and engaging conversations are happening now, spearheaded by people in the deaf community, deaf with a capital D, that are saying, you know, you might perceive this as a limitation, you might perceive this as not, you know, species typical functioning, but we're part of a community and we have a language and we're a rich community. And what you're trying to do is, in fact, destroy our community. And the fact that we communicate in ways that you don't understand is not our problem. So I think there are some very interesting conversations happening, and that's what we need to be open to, with this sort of spirit that we too can learn from other people. So just wanted to make that distinction really clear for people, that in some cases we're talking about manipulating cells in people who live amongst us, and in other cases we're talking about manipulating cells that might one day become a being that we would recognize as human, and those are very different. And one quick thing just to put there for people to think about is, ultimately my own view is that it's not through the manipulation of human embryos that we will be making new humans. It will actually be through the manipulation of gametes. It will be through changing sperm separately or changing eggs separately, and then choosing to make an embryo. And I think we're going to have a whole host of new questions.
Thank you, panelists. So Michael, you wanted to add?
I'll just add one more example to the excellent one that Francoise drew out, which is the case of autism, right? Many people, especially typically parents of children with autism, regard this as a disease, and they want to see a way to have it cured. People with autism talk about neurodiversity and the fact that perhaps we don't all have to have a similar neurology, and there maybe a more good society would actually have space for neurodiversity instead of curing everyone, so to speak, to have a neurotypical characteristics. I can't comment on which is right, but I think there's an important discussion there as well for the way that we understand these kinds of genetic alterations.
Thank you, Michael. I think we have time for one more question. I'm sorry, we have way too many questions to get through today. This question comes from Akash Maharaj. She asks, how can the religious ideal of universal human equality engage with CRISPR's promise to make some human beings inherently superior to others? Francoise, in your book, you talk about the risk that CRISPR could be used to encode human privilege. Other authors talking about CRISPR and the future, particularly around heritable human genome editing, talk about if that is carried on long enough, one could actually create a new species of human different from those who have access to CRISPR versus those who don't have access to CRISPR. Would one of our panelists like to respond to Akash's question?
Well, I'll start just by saying I do worry about increased discrimination, increased marginalization, a new form of what I call techno-eugenics. I worry about unwittingly embracing some kind of genetic determinism, that we are our genes, and so that's what's most important, and therefore we have to expend all this energy to manipulate them. And I'm just really trying to get people to think through, why is it that we think that's a worthwhile project? And I have to say myself, I well understand and appreciate the project of trying to help people who are suffering, who self-identify that their lived experience is one of suffering and illness, and that we would try to bring therapeutic interventions to them. I think we can also think about this in terms of prophylaxis. If we could, through CRISPR, develop, vaccines of a certain kind, we might be thinking that, that's actually a pretty good use of the technology. And that would be considered an enhancement. So I actually don't buy into, therapy good, enhancement bad. I think there are ways in which we need to rethink in subtle ways. And I think, Tracy was alluding to that it's rich and it's complex. And so I think we do, my own view, need to start having these kinds of dialogues across diverse perspectives, understanding the heterogeneity of views, of cultural places, of resources, of hopes, goals, expectations. And the last thing I would say about that is we also need to stop looking at this issue in isolation from everything else that's going on in the world. We can't have a conversation about, for example, heritable human genome editing without talking about the problem of overpopulation, without talking about food insecurity, without talking about climate change. And that's one of the things that I deeply worry about, that it's so complicated. We think we're doing a good job by just carving off this little thing to talk about, but everything's interconnected. And we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to put our time, talent, energy, money? And you can't do that without seeing all of what's in the realm of need and in the opportunities to offer and a response of some kind.
Thank you, Francoise. We have 1 minute left. I'll invite one panelist who wants to have a final response to this question. Moira?
Oh, just I agree with Francoise about everything being interconnected. I think that's such an important point almost to finish on. A little bit of Jim Rusthoven's talking came to my mind when he talked about epigenetics. So no matter how concentrated and how much we edit and how much we create, it isn't only, I think Francoise also said this, it's not just about the genes, it's about our interrelationship, interconnectedness with the world, and how those epigenetic factors will still affect us. So we may not be as wonderfully inherently superior as we try and create.
Can I add just one sentence?
Absolutely.
To shape public norms, I think we need not only good arguments and good information, but a good witness. The example of people who love for their children, family members with disabilities, who care for them in a way that shows that that is not the only thing about them that matters.
And one last sentence, if I can. we need, since I got to get on the bandwagon, right? We need intentionality around our values. We need to clarify what those values are. We need to do that in community.
Panelists, thank you so much for your reflections this afternoon and for participating in such an engaging conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving up an hour and a half of your time today to participate in this conversation with us, to help us to better reflect on theological and ethical implications of CRISPR gene editing technology. In your chat, you will see a survey sent to you by Rebecca Ivanov. Please complete the survey. Tell us what you think about this webinar. If you have suggestions for future webinars, we'd love to hear it. Please, if you are engaged by the question, please respond to the question that Francoise posed. You know, what is the role of faith communities in shaping this international dialogue around the role of CRISPR technology? How should Canadian churches respond? How should we engage with other faith communities? Please send those responses to myself or to my co-chair, Joan Masterton. We will consider them through the Faith and Life Science Reference Group. I want to thank all those who have contributed today. I would like to thank Nicole Rokas, Communications Coordinator for the Canadian Council of Churches, for organizing this, this webinar, to Peter Notaboom for his gracious introduction, Rebecca Ivanov, who has made today's webinar happen so seamlessly, and Joan Masterton, my co-chair, who also helped make today happen so seamlessly. Again, to our panelists, Tracy, Moira, Michael, Francoise, thank you for such a stimulating conversation to help us reflect broadly on how this technology is already influencing our lives and what we might begin to do about that. Thinking back to Stephen Allen's words, from 20 years ago, you know, in some ways it does seem like we are in a new and risky Eden. What will we do in this situation? How will we respond? So one response has been to participate today in the webinar. Our reference group will be having 2 more webinars in the next 12 months. One looking more particularly at synthetic biology, and another one looking at the how artificial intelligence is influencing humanity. We talked about the interconnectedness of things. These are other ways that our world is changing dramatically around us. I'll just give a last minute to our panelists if you want to say one last word to our attendees. Starting with, we'll go in the order of presentation. Tracy?
Thank you for engaging. This is what makes it so valuable, is to have community dialogue and to discern together.
Moira?
Yeah, and I'd love to see everybody's questions because I do believe we learn from each other.
Michael?
Thank you so much for taking the time to engage with this important topic.
And Francoise, all the way from London, England, thank you so much again.
Well, thank you for inviting me to join this illustrious panel. It was really interesting, and I think for the audience, you've had a feast.
We have had a feast indeed. Thank you, everyone. I wish you all the best as you go about your daily business. And again, please, if these questions are engaging, please respond so that we can hear your thoughts and your thinking will spur on our thinking. From all of us to all of you, good night and thank you again. Bye-bye.